with pastors from before, kind of the old, I want to call them the old guard, but the pastors or the church leaders who put spiritual above everything else, right? It was all about, it was all about the Bible, it's all about church, etc. But then you would see the detriment of that, of putting a Bible study ahead of your marriage, or putting a Bible study ahead of spending time with your children, or putting church ahead of all of this other stuff, where ministry became an idol. And then you would see these pastors who are getting divorces, or their kids leaving the church, etc., because, oh, my dad never had time for me, or whatever else it was. I think this over-spiritualizing of everything and neglecting even things. I remember when I was younger, where I would talk about psychology to a pastor, or sociology, because I was interested in it, and they would say, oh, that's antichrist, that's too much humanism, and et cetera. And I wasn't necessarily talking about humanism, but the role of, it's like a lot of these sciences, they're truth, right? I mean, all of the early scientists.
If there's truth in there, we'll find it.
Jesus Christ. Right. And I think that when you're in community, when you follow Jesus Christ, when you forgive, when you let go of bitterness, when you choose to love, when you develop self-control and the fruit of the Spirit, that these are good things psychologically, that there's benefit to these sociologically. It's almost as if psychology has proven the Bible to be true, but the sciences have...
That's Jordan Peterson. Right? I mean, he is so compelled by Christianity because it makes sense of everything.
Right. And so do you think that, when you say that, that is unbiblical, like pietism is unbiblical, what would you say is unbiblical about it? Welcome to the Revo Report. We're inspiring faith with reason and reason with faith.
But that it dichotomy reality, Kate, here's Christianity, you're a Christian, and then all of a sudden, well, there's this material stuff, your job, and the this and the that over there, and yeah, you do it under the Lord, and then over here is the real important spiritual stuff. I talk about it, the two-story reality. So it's like a two-story house. On the upstairs, you might have, like a Victorian, house where it has all kinds of Victorian, and in the downstairs is where you have kind of everyday life in it. But if you want to get the spiritual stuff, you go upstairs. And then you have to have the password to get upstairs. So it's kind of Gnostic in that way. The real true knowledge about stuff that is of value is on the upstairs. And there's nothing biblical about that notion. It's Platonic. Plato had the world of ideal forms, and the material was something to be escaped. That was Gnosticism. It was a Christian heresy. And so it's terribly unbiblical. It doesn't mean that person doesn't have a relationship with Jesus. It doesn't. I mean, our pastor, I would turn to my wife sometimes and I'll say, that's pietistic. And he's a Christian worldview guy. This doesn't apply. Politics is over there, and this tends to be...
We're segregating, yeah. When Jesus said he's the way, the truth, and the life, he's everything.
Right.
He is that singularity, right?
I've showed this to some people in other interviews, but it's called The Political Sermons of the American Founding Era, 1730 to 1805. So if you can see how thick that book is...
These are sermons.
So, these are sermons, and they're long and they're intricate and well argued. But thank God that America's founding pastoral generation didn't see the faith as somehow only for spiritual things, but not for grubby stuff of politics.
Oh.
In fact, human government could not be any more spiritual. Right? Because it's spiritual creatures doing things to bring peace and justice. That's kind of what it's all about, right? Justice is the most biblical of values. And if Christians aren't going to do it based on God's ultimate law, then where's it going to come from? Man's law? And Alfred started that. Alfred the Great started his, I forget what they call it now, but Alfred the Great made his law, started it based on the 10 Commandments.
And I think a lot of kids are going to wrestle with this, especially when they reach their teens, they're able to think for themselves, and they're going to go, how relevant is this for me if the church is just spiritual in nature, right? How is the church relevant to my schooling? How is Jesus relevant to my relationships, my friends, and what am I going to do for life, et cetera, my relationships? And I think that, separating those two, creating that false dichotomy really is unbiblical. What do you think about the early church movement, like the early apostles, or the early church movement, maybe, in the first century, second century, can you see how they weren't, they didn't give into this pietism, so to speak, that they weren't pietists? Do you see stories of that in your research?
Well, I mean, so Jesus said give to Caesar, right? The Sadducees, I think it was, who came up to him and said, is it right to pay taxes to Caesar? Give him a coin. Whose image is this? Well, give to God's the things that are God's, and to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Mm-hmm. So he automatically said, okay, there's these separate spheres, and you cannot have Caesar over God's things.
Right.
Which was truly revolutionary. And that had to be worked out over the centuries. But when you have the apostles, right, they were clearly looking at their faith and applying it to everything. I mean, like Paul says, not only in this age. Of course it's for this age. Christ is king. Jesus is Lord meant that, right? And Paul was a Roman citizen, and he always said, hey, if I had to, in Acts, right, he says, if I've done anything to deserve death, I'm willing to pay the price, right? He believed that there was right and wrong. And it's just, again, you have to see the growth of Platonism and the growth of this kind of overly spiritualized material is bad. And it grew up through Catholicism and monastic life, let's get away. And so it's been there forever. You just got to go back to Judaism, right? They were all the first century Christians, first 10 years, 20 years, they were all Jews. And if you look at the Old Testament, there's no dichotomy. There's no spiritual realm versus everything was God's. And so that's an easy argument to make. Very easy. And again, it's such a wonderful thing to be able to sell to your kids. Because again, not in a million years would my children find secularism more appealing to them than Christianity. This ain't happening. Like my son, I would mock him as he's growing up because he was a musician, and he would want a guitar or some gear. It would come in the mail. I'd say, Dominic, now your life is fulfilled. You have meaning and hope and purpose. And he'd say, shut up. But I was teaching him, you're not going to find your fulfillment in that. But if you find your fulfillment in Jesus, then you can have fulfillment in those things, right? It's not either or. But you see that now this is a gift. The music is a gift. One day we're going into church, and it was just he and I for some reason. And he goes, Dad, I like music. He must have been 14 or something. He goes, Dad, I like music more than apologetics. And I go, dude, music is apologetics. Like, where do you think rhythm comes from in harmony and, melody? Do you think these things are just kind of felt? Do you think we're just lucky dirt? No, God created it for our enjoyment and his glory. And, you just program. That's what we bring to people. It could be our kids, it could be our neighbor, It's so persuasive, Christianity. It's so plausible and so powerful and so wonderful. And you just, none of us are going to be perfect. And bringing this hope, we give to Voice of the Martyrs. I don't know if you're familiar with them, Richard Wurmbrand, and he founded this organization for persecuted Christians around the world. And I read it every month, and it just, it's like, oof. And, they may not be transforming their society at this moment, but Jesus brings hope and peace and endurance, to their lives. And I pray for China. I pray for all the persecuted everywhere, because one day those nations have to become Christian as well. Right? That's the Great Commission. Not just the people within them, but the nations themselves. Yeah.
When we talked about, the coin, right? And give to Caesar what is Caesar's, and what is the image on that coin? And it's Caesar's image. And, to contrast that with us, what is the image on us, created in the image of God? So we give our all to him, right? In everything that we do, whether we eat or drink or anything, we give glory to God. We don't separate those things from our worship to God.
Way much rather.
I had 20 questions for you originally. I'm 3 questions in because of a lot of the side questions that we're in. So
we should do it again. Well, that'd be up to you.
This has been brilliant. If I could have you again here, I know I've already taken up, we're almost 2 hours in here, but it's just been a thrill. You guys got to pick it up. Where can they get this? I know you sent this to me from Amazon.
Yep. Amazon, Barnes and Noble. I don't know what 80% of all books are sold through Amazon. It's incredible. And even Bezos has had his red pill. Did you hear that?
I have not.
So, he was with Trump at the inauguration, and he didn't allow the New York
the tech giants were there, which was
right.
Tech
he didn't allow the Washington Post to, and then just recently, last week, in fact, he said he's not going to allow kind of the leftists on the opinion page anymore. It's going to be for free enterprise and America and liberty.
Wow. Bezos said this.
He told Great Awakening, he told the editor of the editorial page, he said, if you're not all in, tell me please, and you can leave. And the guy said, I'm not. He resigned. because he's not for liberty and capitalism, economic flourishing, and so on and so forth.
Yeah,
people are seeing
that's
the
crazy.
vibe shift.
Well, when that was happening to Zuckerberg, people were going, "Oh, it can't be real." Mark this is just something he's doing for Facebook, et cetera. And then he puts out this post, and you see him there at the inauguration, and he's talking about how Facebook will never again censor if the government tries to force them to censor, influence them, or bully them into censoring, et cetera. Right? And just to see these tech giants, and even on YouTube, right? Because for a long time, conservatives and Christians on YouTube, they would get ghosted, right? Or they would get somehow shadow censored, and you'd still be allowed there, but then the algorithm wouldn't push them.
You couldn't find it, right?
No, you couldn't find it. And I've seen this now even with my own channel, where actually even YouTube is giving voices to the conservatives now, and you're seeing just this move of freedom of speech is important,
right? And these people, they're like anybody else. They don't want to be hoodwinked. They don't want to buy the lie. They don't want to live a lie. Solzhenitsyn, don't live by the lie. So the progressives, Obama was big into this because this was Martin Luther King. The arc of history bends in a certain way toward justice and so on and so forth. It doesn't bend toward Marxism. It bends toward Jesus, toward the truth. And that's what we have on our side. And I mean, wow, that's why you have to be confident and optimistic and excited, because he who is the truth is revealing these things, and they don't have to be spiritual all the time, because they're all spiritual anyway. And remarkable. It's thrilling. It's wow. It's just wow.
Amazing. Man, I love your energy. You guys check out Mike in his website as well. Get a copy of this book, because, it's filled with a lot of things that we can see is important, knowing our history, so that we can propel forward. So make sure you guys check that out. Mike, it has been a thrill. This is actually the longest interview we've conducted. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Really. My honor. God bless you, brother.